I'm so excited to be here tonight with Jarett. I get sent, this sounds kind of self-aggrandizing, but I do get sent a lot of books to blurb. And it's rare that I get one that's absolutely terrific. It was a joy to read your book. I'm so excited to talk to you about it. And among other things.
What are the other things?
I don't know. I mean, we can go over a wide range of subjects, but.
Sure.
I grew up in New York, and I spent most of my 12, 13, 14 years, in my teenage years, scouring the Village Voice and the New York Press for the listings of, I wanted to go out, but I didn't know what going out meant. And I would like pour through the paper and be like, I want to go out, and there are all these things to do. And I read your book, and I was like, that's what I wanted. You know, it was this world that I was so intrigued by. And I finally got out to the limelight in 1992, and it was everything I hoped for, but nothing I really wanted to partake in. So, so it was a joy to read.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Before we started, I wanted to talk a little bit about the relationship between this book and I Hate the Internet, which is a previous book of yours, though a sequel to this one.
Right.
And maybe you could talk a little bit about the relationship between these two books, both in terms of content and in terms of like publishing history.
Sure. Well, I wrote this before I wrote I Hate the Internet, and that was in 2011 and 2012, and it's been substantially revised since then. So it's not totally stale writing. And I could not get this book published. And I actually think part of that was because I had this really bizarre conceit in the book where there were only 11 chapters because the book takes place across 11 years, and each of the chapters was anywhere between 10 to 15,000 words long, which is asking a lot of anyone to read. And then I was in San Francisco, and when I was in San Francisco, it was a really torturous experience. And I decided that when I left San Francisco, I decided that I wanted to write a book about the tech industry and about really the miserable experience of being in San Francisco in that moment of 2013. And it occurred to me that I could use the protagonist, or one of the two protagonists from this book, as the protagonist of I Hate the Internet, because, you know, the people in the future won't be long. The two protagonists, they're both in their 20s, they're Gen X. The book takes place between 1986 and 1996, and it struck me that there's a lot of people who were young in that moment who then had to figure out how to use the internet. And so in I Hate the Internet, the character Adeline sort of gets publicly shamed on Twitter or on the internet, and then sort of has to learn how to use Twitter. Now, a book about someone learning how to use Twitter is not really the most compelling thing in the world. But if you have this really wild person who had this really wild past, then you could you could see how it would sort of work. You could see how you could sort of make it go forward and not be as dry and as terrible as my little capsule summary just sounded. And then the other thought I had when I Hate the Internet came out was to just like generate enough heat off of that. Because I sort of think of publishing like drug dealing, where every deal sets up the next deal. And so the idea was like, you know, generate enough heat off of I Hate the Internet to then finally figure out a way to have people pay attention enough to sell this. Because I always felt like this would be fine if it could actually get a fair airing.
It's an interesting analogy to drug dealing because you didn't quite self-publish, but created your own publishing company to release I Hate the Internet. So
yeah,
you're a drug dealer, or like I'm not sure where to go with that.
If I am the world's least profitable drug dealer.
Oh, I'm not sure about that. Yeah. I think I know that guy.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, the way to self-publish, it struck me, was to adhere to a model that a lot of people in California have used, like Ferlinghetti has used it with City Lights, Dave Eggers used it with McSweeney's, and Chris Kraus even with Semiotext, where you can publish yourself, but you also sort of have to publish your friends or people that you respect, and which may not be the same thing. And then you can sort of legitimize your own self-publication, because nothing is more delegitimized than publishing yourself, because it seems like, you know, what mad people do. And so that was the whole idea.
So you must have had two completely different experiences, although this book just came out today.
Yeah, it just came out today.
So we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, ask in a week, and I'll...
Maybe it was better to self-publish.
No, I don't know. This book could never have been self-published. No. This book never would have worked as a self-published book. And, you know, working with Viking has been really good and really interesting.
Well, you set up in I Hate the Internet a paradigm between the good novels and bad novels.
Right.
And very self-consciously throughout I Hate the Internet, you refer to it as a bad novel. And, you know, somewhat satirically, but also sort of rightfully so, that this is not what the publishing industry is interested in, obviously, because they weren't at that stage. But one of the, it's funny, I'm like right in the eyesight of the John and the Franzen section up there. But you set up that, you know, you use Franzen as a touchstone for the good novel, the so-called good novel, books about white bourgeois people interested in, you know, sex, mortgage payments, etc.
Right.
Is The Future Won't Be Long a good novel?
It's perilously close to a good novel. You know, it was written in a moment before San Francisco killed my faith in humanity. So it's much more of a celebratory book. It's about a friendship through time that spans 11 years and actually has hope in humanity, which I Hate the Internet doesn't.
No, not really.
No.
But it seems like these are genre categories rather than questions of quality.
Right.
It's not like good novels are necessarily, you know, good in terms of prose.
Right,
and
right.
bad novels. I mean, there must be tons of examples of good bad novels that, you know.
Yeah. I could name some.
Why don't you?
But I won't. No, this is part of my ongoing professionalization, is not shitting on other writers anymore.
I don't think it's shitting on them if the bad novel is a
is.
question. Oh, really?
Yeah, it kind of is.
Well, I mean, you know, I write books that have, you know, marginal characters in them, and I get in a lot of trouble for it. You know, like why are these people, you know, not white, and why are they, you know, on drugs, and why are they impoverished, and is this important? So, is that a bad novel?
I read Visitation Street yesterday. Actually, it's all right. Well, so to get into the theory of the good novel as presented in the book, it's this idea, which sounds like you're completely insane when you say it, but actually isn't, that literary fiction in the mid-century was constructed as statist literature. And there's a lot of examples of the CIA. And every time you say the CIA, well, maybe not anymore, but a year ago, when you started talking about the CIA, you could just sort of watch people drift to the door. There's a lot of examples of the CIA doing a lot of cultural funding in the mid-century of institutions that were really, really formative in the idea of literary fiction and sort of what it's calcified into in this moment. And so, you know, like the CIA funded Iowa, the CIA funded the Paris Review. And I think you would be hard-pressed to find two institutions more responsible for that specific calcification. And then and the idea was that, particularly at Iowa, I think it was like they funded a program where writers would be brought in from the third world and sort of be convinced to write essentially literary fiction, and then literary fiction would have some propagandizing effect on the rest of the world. And so there's a way to look at literary fiction as fundamentally statist fiction. And that is what I Hate the Internet objected too. And I don't know if this is statist fiction, but maybe it is. You know, like maybe everyone who was in the East Village was in service of the state in an indirect way.
It's funny to hear you talk about it that way, because there's a certain persona adapted by the narrator of I Hate the Internet, whoever that is. It's so dangerous to say you are the narrator. It's like a total pitfall.
Yeah, no, it's not me. It's not me.
But the idea seems to be, you know, that that's your belief in this paradigm.
Yeah, I mean, I mostly believe in it. It also was useful in the context of the book because I felt like the book by itself, I really like books that create their own critical explanation because it sort of jumps over the problem of other people creating critical explanations of what the book is. Because if you already do the groundwork, you know, most people will just glom onto that. And I was like, well, here's a chapter that can explain what the book is supposed to be.
You want to do away with all those conversations of intentionality, like
and just sort of have the intent just be text.
Right. Yeah, subtext is a dangerous thing to go into a project with.
Yeah, I think that's probably right.
Yeah, I get that. I teach creative writing a lot, and people are like, but my theme is this, you know, I'm going to release this. Like, because I had to internet stalk someone with who wrote a book called I Hate the Internet. I read a few of your interviews. And I mean, it's like, you have a pretty low profile on that internet until recently.
Yeah, I mean, I don't use social media. I don't use
You just friended me on Facebook.
Yeah, yeah. Other than, well, but that's because I was going to, I did an event for this book on Facebook, and then I was going to make you.
I was blindsided.
I was going to make you a co-host or something, and then I forgot. So,
I did read in one of your interviews in my limited internet stalking, which only happened like 2 days ago. Because
that's the best kind.
Yeah, I always come to these events and I'm like, oh yeah, you're supposed to read all these interviews and then regurgitate the questions that you've already answered in previous online interviews, which I'm about to do right now.
Here we go.
This is not original thought. But you said that fiction is good at getting at psychological truths that are impossible to prove.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And I was wondering what those truths are in The Future Won't Be Long, because it's a book that could very easily be interpreted as it's a party book in a certain way. Right. It's about a scene, it's about an environment, but there's a serious relationship there. And I'm wondering how you apply that.
Well, I think there's two things that are going on in the book. The first thing is that you do have this friendship that grows through time. Excuse me. And that is the two protagonists who meet in 1986, and then sort of have this friendship that has its ups and downs, like every major friendship that ends up shaping our lives. And it becomes a book that is a meditation on that friendship, and is a meditation on how these really close friendships are sort of the only thing that saves us from ourselves in the end. And there's just sort of this on the surface, there's just sort of this friendship, and it's this demonstration of how if you don't really keep these people close to you, it probably is terrible in the end. And then the other thing about it too is, like, which we haven't mentioned yet, but a lot of the book is set in the club scene, and particularly... Oh,
we're going to mention that.
Yeah.
Don't worry.
well, I'm getting to one of these apparent truths. And, you know, like the club scene it's the club scene of Michael Alig. It's the club scene after Andy Warhol is dead. And there's this moment where Alig sort of comes to the fore and then dominates it for 8 or 9 years, and then ends up killing his drug dealer. And it becomes this, it becomes a story. And the thing about when he killed his drug dealer is that everyone in the city knew. Michael Musto reported it in the Village Voice. He was doing occasional appearances where he'd be like, yeah, I killed Angel.
Well, there's that amazing documentary where he's being interviewed where they can't find Angel. And there's and then he's being interviewed at the beginning of the documentary, and his hair is blonde. And towards the end of the documentary, his hair is red, and it's because he's chopped up Angel's body, and they say, he had to dye his hair because they got blood all over himself. So
yeah, and everyone knew, and I think there is something really interesting in interrogating that for a handful of things, which is it's really, really easy to mythologize this stuff 10 years later or 15 years later. It's really easy to be like, well, the East Village was great, and it was this thing, and it was great. I mean, don't get me wrong, it really was an amazing place, but something about those social scenes can create really deeply unsavory conditions where everyone can be a participant in a murder.
You got to that. You did such an amazing job in the book of taking us from the the moment when when I was first interested in going to clubs and just completely obsessed with being allowed to go out to clubs, and it was this glorious thing to watch this horrible disintegration into. It's just like watching a party disintegrate into when nothing good happens between 4 and 6 in the morning, and your book sort of it's not going to get any better, and your book sort of touches on that 4 to 6 period where the last people at the club, the last people on the scene are really, really, really taking it to a level that's inexcusable.
I mean, it got incredibly dark. It turned into a really dark moment. And, and then it also becomes a way of thinking about prohibition. Because my theory, and this is for which I have no evidence really, is that if you create a situation where you have prohibition of drugs, which at the time, and it's, drug use has turned into something much more frightening in the country than it was during this period. But if you have drugs outlawed, and you have people who, by virtue of their social connections and also by virtue that it is all a big party, those people, when they're doing drugs, no one feels like they're breaking the law, right, when they're smoking pot, unless there's cops near them and they happen to be one of the groups that cops target for this. But for a guy like Michael, who was at the heart of the city, who was throwing these parties that everyone was coming to, it was like clearly that's never an idea about, like, the legality of it never really becomes an issue. The thing that I think can happen with that is when you make these laws against things that are relatively harmless, and then you really empower certain people to break those laws, it does not become a far leap to breaking other laws. Like, if all of the law is the same, and everyone in the city is like, yeah, Michael, do ecstasy. Michael, get really high. You can see how that would be warping of someone's psychology to the point where murder itself becomes less than this abhorrent thing that I think everyone agrees it is.
Yeah, I mean, it was so fascinating because were you living here during that?
Oh yeah, that's when I moved here, when it all started to go to shit.
Watching that unfold on a daily basis was one of the most, it was remarkable just to see all the information that we all had about this. And, Michael was going out to parties and people would say, well, there's that, his Freeze, Angel's missing. I guess Freeze is the guy who helped him.
Right, yeah.
But you corresponded with Michael in the...
Not a huge amount, but a little bit. Yeah, because when I was writing the book, he was still in jail.
Are you buying some of his memorabilia on eBay?
I've got too much shit in my house. When I was writing it, I was buying a bunch of not from him, but from other people who were selling on eBay.
I have to say that when I started reading this, I was so blown away by the detail. And I have a lot of friends who worked at clubs, as I've told you. My friends were Peter Gation's two assistants.
Right.
The stories they told were pretty crazy. But I did email them. And I'm like, do you know this guy, Jarett? Like, he's written this book. And and then I figured this is before I internet stalked you. I realized that you're a little bit younger than I am, just slightly. I was like, he couldn't have been at this scene. So you must have researched this.
Yeah, I did a lot of research. I had done this novella in 2010 that was published in 2011 called Atta, which is about Muhammad Atta, one of the 9/11 hijackers, and it really taught me how to research, and it really taught me how to do a kind of writing where if you weren't there, you could sort of piece it together from the research. And so this, I mean, I started this book actually when I was on tour for Atta. And all of that bled in. And then it was just like a year of writing and a year of doing endless research and just like digging crap up.
And you read The Voice. How did you do it? This is so...
I read 11 years of The Voice, yeah.
Wow.
Which was instructive. I mean, Michael Musto is, I think, an unheralded American genius. If you read those columns in their entirety, which is, you know, well, I didn't read all of them, but I did read 11 years, you really come away with what a national treasure that guy was and how really astonishing that the column was. And
it was terrific.
And then, you know, a lot of the stuff was really covered. The internet was quite different then too, because there were still message boards where people would be trading tips and, you know, or memories or whatever, and you could just sort of piece it together. I don't know if you could do it now.
Well, La Dolce Musto was fascinating because, you know, you would turn to it to recap. Like, it was for people in the know, but also people who wanted to be in the know. And there's sort of, it let you in on the secret of this scene. And he was always dropping hints about, you know, he was dropping hints about Michael forever.
Yeah.
For months, couple months that.
I think his first column he ran a blind item in March 1996 where if you knew anyone, you would know who the people were. But there were no names attached. And then as the weeks rolled on, he was just more and more clear about what it was. Like, you know, little items about Michael singing If I Had a Hammer and all of this.
Yikes.
Yeah.
I remember that. I also love that it's rare that a story is sort of unveiled in the press and not investigated by the authorities at the same time.
Well, I mean, you know, the human tragedy in it is that Angel Melendez was everything that the NYPD had no interest in. He was gay, he was Latino, and he was a drug dealer. And so until his body washed up, and the only way it really even got linked to him is that I think A.J. Benza had a column in the New York Post claiming that he had washed up in the Harlem River, but he didn't understand which direction the Harlem River flowed in, so it couldn't have been what he was saying. But like a beat cop in Staten Island, I believe Staten Island, read the article and he was like, yeah, we found a body. Maybe it's this body. But there was absolutely no investigation of it.
A.J. Benz is a deep old school New York reference there. Amazing. But how do you research something? Because, of course, you know, Clubland's a huge part of the book, but also the book ranges over a whole bunch of cultural references. How do you know what's inside Bret Easton Ellis's apartment in like 1990? Because, you know, I checked with some people who'd been there, and they say you got it pretty good. So,
yeah, Matthew Spector said it was all right.
He threw that question over here.
You know, with someone like with Ellis, that guy was so covered that all you have to do is find old photographs and pay attention to the details in the photographs. 'Cause how many times was he photographed in that apartment?
That's true.
And also, you know, I think American Psycho is set in that building, actually. So he likes to put his address in books. I just read Imperial Bedrooms. It's set in his apartment, and I think he gives the actual address.
So that was a pretty dumb question that Matthew told me to ask you.
But no, and then I mean, there was something else where I figured out his address, and then I found the real estate listing, and then a couple of years later, Gothamist actually ran a thing with his floor plan. But I had found it before that. I was, you know, I was into Bret Easton Ellis's apartment before it was a thing. The most amazing thing about that is that Matthew Spector, who is this wonderful Los Angeles writer that we're both friends with, we had sent a copy of a galley to Bret Easton Ellis, and then he started bugging Bret Easton Ellis at dinner, and I guess he had read it, and Bret Easton Ellis fact-checked his own appearance in the book.
I heard that.
And the only thing that he objected to is in the book I had Bobby Brown playing on the stereo, and he was like, no, I would have been listening to Debbie Gibson.
That's a big admission.
But no, I thought it was so brilliant, and I thought it was such a really weird example of how you can get 95% of things right, and then there's that 5% that's really hard to get over, because I'm too young to remember when pop music by white people had cultural credibility, right? Like, there was a moment where people really were listening to Huey Lewis and the News, and it was like, this is amazing. This is what I want to rock at the party. And like, because I'm, you know, slightly younger than him, for me, it was like when he was looking at what was on the radio in 1990, it was like, of course it would be Bobby Brown. That's what we were all listening to.
Right. Did he have any objections to his, you did his voice, you know?
Yeah. No, I mean, I don't think you get to be Bret Easton Ellis if you do not know how to play a certain game.
Right.
And I think for him, he just sees it as part of that game.
You have a lot of authors in this book, Tom Dish, Bret Easton Ellis, and Norman Mailer.
Right.
So you don't have, there's not too much love lost between you and Norman Mailer.
Well, I love Norman Mailer. I think Mailer was, you know, Mailer wrote too many books, which I'm in danger of doing, but not that bad. He really wrote too many books. But there's about 5 or 6 books there where if you take away the racism, if you take away the sexism, if you take away the general self-regard and obnoxiousness, there is a radiant core in there of something really amazing. And I think he probably will have a resurgence when everyone who knew him is dead. But for the time being, you know, there's too many people who had to deal with him.
Yeah. It's funny because I remember in Jonathan Letham's Dissident Gardens, there's that scene where they're walking across the Brooklyn Bridge and they're going to that party at Norman Mailer's apartment.
See, I haven't read Dissident Gardens, which is...
That's fine.
Which is me as a terrible Lethamite, so...
It's okay. I mean, he's written a lot of books, too.
Yes,
it's kind of hard to keep up.
Yeah.
He's written an introduction to every book you've read, too.
Yeah, he wrote the introduction to the forthcoming edition of Anna Kavan's Ice, which is an amazing book.
Every book I pick up, he's written the introduction. He even blurbed my local bookstore before it closed. Like Brookcourt was like, had a blurb from Jonathan Lethem on all their bookmarks. Wow. But he has this... There's a moment in Dissident Gardens where they're walking across the Brooklyn Bridge and they're going to a party at Norman Mailer's house. And you sort of have that sort of Norman Mailer's house as this kind of strange cultural outpost in Brooklyn.
Yeah, I just wanted something about Norman Mailer in there. And also I did sort of think, because it's relatively late in the book, that there had to be some Brooklyn in there as the 90s rolled on, because it's a really Manhattan-centric book. Because I've never understood Brooklyn. And I lived in Manhattan for 9 years, in Brooklyn for 1 year, and it was just a sort of mutual confusion. And
I grew up in Brooklyn. So
I know you did. Yeah.
I understand that because we would, you know, that's how, that was, I was talking about Brooklyn was hard back then. Now it's I don't understand Brooklyn now.
Now it is a pretext for T-shirts on every German in Istanbul. That is Brooklyn.
You say as much, and I hate the internet.
That is Brooklyn. You can go anywhere in Istanbul, and there will be a German with a T-shirt that says Brooklyn somewhere.
Copenhagen too. They have like a Brooklyn bar.
Yes,
they have like a whole
do.
Brooklyn themed. Like it's like a bar, and you can buy all this Brooklyn stuff. It's like their idea of Williamsburg.
Yeah,
it's like we don't need to export that. It's something we should keep to ourselves. It's a little embarrassing. I want to talk a little bit about Adeline and Baby.
Sure.
You know, it's dangerous to say they're familiar characters because they're familiar in a very narrow sense of, in my life, maybe in your life, because you lived in Manhattan, Brooklyn, we are a certain type of person. We do know people like Adeline and Baby. They're not outrageous characters. But to a lot of the world, they're really different. And they're also interesting people to take us through this. I mean, from 1986 to when does I Hate the Internet end?
2013.
So it's almost 3 decades of their lives. How did you choose these people to tell this story?
With Adeline, it was like, I'm just old enough that when I was like 14 and wandering around Providence, Rhode Island, you could meet these really wild women who were Gen X women, and they would, you know, you'd somehow end up in their apartments, and it would just be this mad scene. And then, you know, like probably the most ridiculous media example of it would be all of the people who were in L7, which was not a very good band, but a band that I am endlessly fond of. And, you know, if you're 14 and you're somehow in the apartment of like a 22-year-old or a 23-year-old who's just wild and interesting, like this is sort of what forms your understanding of what the futures will be like. But a lot of those girls, I don't know what happened. They sort of disappeared, at least in that incarnation. And I really, I don't know, I was like, well, if you're going to write about this moment, because, you know, again, like I said, The Future Won't Be Long was written before I Hate the Internet. If you're going to write about this moment, this is clearly what you should write about. And then in terms of Baby is very autobiographical. And then also about 2 or 3 really close friends thrown in. And just like this amalgamation that turned into a character that was able to really drive the book. 'Cause I think ultimately probably The Future Won't Be Long is his book. And I Hate the Internet is Adeline's book.
Oh, for sure. I agree with, he also has that summation at the end of The Future Won't Be Long, that he's thinking of writing a book that is this book.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, it definitely seemed to me to be his book. And then when we switched to her voice, I don't know, and you never know, but obviously you wrote it. But it was in my mind, it was his version of her voice.
Right, I know what you mean.
It wasn't like she was telling that story.
Yeah. She appears in a slightly different form. And I Hate the Internet.
Yeah, that's true. She's a really interesting character. It's a big swing to have a character. She talks like, I guess you say that Breakfast at Tiffany's imprinted on her.
Yeah,
she's got this sort of transcontinental accent.
She has an atrocious transatlantic accent that gets worse and worse the more that I write her. So when you read The Future Won't Be Long at the beginning, it's almost normal. By the time you get to the end of it, it's pretty wild. And then you get into I Hate the Internet, and it's practically Shakespearean diction in some places. But I like characters like that. I like characters that do not let you forget that you're reading a book.
Yeah. I mean, it's also like real life. You become a more eccentric version of yourself as you age. You know, you just see her going through that, you know, and she forgets that she can talk like I mean, we all know people like this.
Right, well, my accent is completely fake. I'm from Rhode Island. You're lucky I can even speak English.
I was wondering.
in any kind of comprehensible dialect, you know. So like I'm really interested in people who change their accent, because I changed mine.
I know it's a horribly sexist thing to say, but I often associate it with women I went to college with. They did a semester in like London and suddenly, you know, come back speaking, you know, theater people.
Right.
I'm thinking of like 4 people in particular. None of whom are here. But she really has that sort of, but she sort of becomes this other person through that accent too. Like her tastes are modified. And
yeah.
Now, did you want to write science fiction? Is that how Baby...
Yeah, I mean, ultimately I am nothing if not a failed science fiction writer. But I had this really bizarre misunderstanding of science fiction when I was a teenager, where all I read was the new wave, like Thomas Dish or Harlan Ellison or Ursula K. Le Guin or Philip K. Dick especially, and had this delusion that science fiction was not a conservative literature, which I think ultimately most of it ends up being. And so I really just thought, well, this is what you can do. And then, you know, I Hate the Internet, actually, there's a semi-autobiographical character who finds these rejection letters for these short stories that he wrote. Or no, he finds the query letters of these science fiction short stories that he wrote in like 1992 or 1993. And I put them in the book. And those are actual letters that I wrote, and they seem like they were written by a psychotic.
They didn't seem that bad to me.
They're pretty bad. I think there's a line. It
depends how old you were when you wrote them.
I was like 14, but I mean, there's a line in one of them that's like, you know, this is a good story. I am not great and make no claims for greatness, but it is good.
You're hedging there.
Yeah.
I like that there's that when he goes to the reading and reads them out loud. There were all those readings in New York where people went and like read from their diaries from their 12. It was
Right.
kind of a bad moment in culture.
Well, I've done that actually.
Me too.
Yeah. No. I mean, I've read those letters.
I've read the diary readings. It's just so dreadful. You think it means something, and you think you're like at the edge of something really cool, but just a bunch of people reading crap.
No, I found these letters on a hard drive that I wrote, on a hard drive from like 1996, and then when I kept getting invited to readings, that would be the only thing. And this is like 4 years ago. Those would be what I would read because I thought they were so much better than anything I had written.
Is that why you didn't want to read tonight?
I'm a terrible reader of my own work.
Really?
Actually, I'm appalling. I don't have whatever it is that you have to have. You can, if you look into my eyes, you can see it's not there. Like,
I mean, it must be hard to read Adeline's voice too, because it's voicey.
Yeah, there's that as well.
Yeah,
so.
it reads really well, but I can imagine bringing that to life might be the worst of Adeline.
Yeah,
all of us.
It's really difficult to read.
It's hard. I don't enjoy reading dialogue and that kind of.
Yeah, dialogue is very difficult. I mean, I can read if I write a piece to be read. I can do that, but the stuff for the page is almost impossible.
So one of the pitfalls this book nicely avoids is the trap of nostalgia. You know, I mean, as a native New Yorker who is always being called out by my friends for like being pointlessly obsessed with grungy old New York to the detriment of my own like sanity. Like it was so much better back then, you know, but your book really avoids the idea that this was a period to long for, but just as a period that existed.
Yeah, I hate nostalgia. Although I do think the book must have been motivated by some in the, like you don't do this unless you have some nostalgia for the moment.
For sure.
But it wasn't a really happy time, you know, for anyone. And, you know, one of the ways by which you can avoid that is by incorporating violence. And there were a lot of really insane murders. And not just, you know, like someone shot someone, but like this guy, Daniel Rakowitz, who killed his roommate, Monica Burrell, and then dismembered her in a bathtub, cooked her head on a stove, and then made it into soup and served soup to the homeless people in Tompkins Square. That's hard to be nostalgic for.
Though many people are nostalgic for Tompkins Square Park as a shooting gallery.
Yeah,
it's a dangerous.
We all have our demons. So.
Yeah, I mean, but it's true. The violence of that era is so glossed over by the fact that we now lament the condo and co-opization of the Lower East Side.
Yeah, I mean, do not get me wrong. I really think that is not a healthy development in any way. But at the same time, there was a kind of really crazy violence in that moment, which, you know, really does kill nostalgia. And actually, one of the reasons why Rakowitz is in the book is because that story is so incredibly similar to Michael Alig's story, even down to the body being dismembered in a bathtub. And it struck me that that was a way to cut against the ultimate glamour of Michael Alig, because with Michael, everything was fabulous, right? But no one is posting to Tumblr about how glamorous Daniel Rakowitz was.
People are still really mythologizing Michael Alig, you know. I mean, he's probably driving that machine a little bit, you know. But it is interesting how what he did is completely horrific. But it was done in this sort of glamour, well, reverse glamorous milieu where you're like, that it's not excusable, but we sort of watched it unfold. Like, it was like watching TV.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I mean, you know, credit to Michael. The club kid scene was incredible. Yeah. It was such an amazing flowering. It was such an amazing thing. And then it just soured. The party went on too long.
Well, it was unsustainable. That sort of, you know, the parties that he threw got more and more. I mean, we could talk about clubs forever if you wanted to. But the parties that he threw got more and more maniacal with blood and, you know, torture.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, it just, you can't get, it's sort of, you keep pushing the envelope looking for the next most horrifying thing, and eventually I guess you get to murder.
Well, and I think there's a thing in the book, which I can't remember if it's in there. I hope it is, where I think Michael, you know, and this is me speaking totally out of turn, but I think everyone was haunted by the ghost of Andy Warhol, right? And Warhol, for 20 years, had been this cultural figure for kids who were complete misfits in their towns, right? And you could see Andy on Love Boat, or you could see Andy in Newsweek, and there was this really amazing party in New York that you could go to, and you know, you could go there, and everything that was wrong with you would become something that was right with you. And then when Andy died, there's this power vacuum, and Michael steps into it, and it's a very similar thing. The thing is, what a lot of the imitators of Warhol have a hard time, or had a hard time with, but still have a hard time with, is that what sustained Warhol for a really long time is that Warhol was the foremost American artistic genius of the 20th century, and that there was something else going on.
There's a substance beyond
the parties.
Yeah. I mean, I remember watching like Donahue, and the club kids would go on Donahue, and you just see this, like, the audience was like bifurcated between people who were just like absolutely horrified, and then you just see the kids who are just, that all I want to do is get to New York and be part of
the kids were amazing. I mean, it was a really amazing moment. It was it was an incredibly beautiful moment that went on too long and ended in tragedy.
Yeah, and now it seems like a crazy cultural artifact, because you look at clubs now and it's so anodyne and kind of horrifying.
That's true, but and not to get too much into this, because I think we all get too much of this on a daily basis. One of the things that's terrifying is, like, this is where Trump was hanging out. There's an article in New York Magazine about the opening of Club USA, which was a Peter Gateshian club.
Midtown, right?
Yeah, in Midtown, in Times Square. And Trump's there.
Did he go down the giant slide into the balls?
He may very well have. You know, I mean, and that sort of becomes, and there's, after he won the election, I thought I would put a scene with him in the book, and then decided against it, because I feel like anything about Trump ends up just becoming about Trump. But there's now like a slight reference in the final book to him, which isn't in the galley that you have.
I'll have to reread it.
Yeah, well, it's 5 words. But it's something, but that, you know, that sort of was the weird thing about the club kids, is it wasn't just club kids. People were making a lot of money off of it, and there were a lot of people involved in the power structure of New York who were there in the VIP room.
Absolutely. I mean, my friend worked at the Limelight, and the way they made their money was the private parties that people like Trump and whatever would throw, and also selling drugs off the back of
course.
But and that's what brought it down.
Yeah.
That's ultimately. Would you like to take some questions from people besides me?
Sure. Be kind.
I'm curious, as someone who's followed your writing, You mentioned Ferlinghetti earlier, and it seems to me some of what you've been doing is resuscitating elements of beat literature, literary friendship, continuing characters through books. And we didn't mention BTW, which is another book. So can you talk a little bit about that tradition and, you know, where it overlaps and the things that are worth rejecting still from it?
Relative to the beats, how? I'm not sure I get.
Well, I mean, it does seem like that was a moment where these continuing through lines through poems, through novels, through different things that were built very much on literary friendships and the kinds of, and early on, the kinds of self-publishing you were talking about.
Right.
That, I guess that's what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I mean, I am hugely influenced by the beats in some ways. When I was 17, I went and met Burroughs at his house with my high school graduation money. Actually, with a guy who's in the back of the room who I haven't seen in 20 years. But no, I know what you mean. I don't know how to contextualize it. I can say in my own work that it has started to make sense to me to have all of the books connect. And the reason why is because this was actually something that people did in literary fiction all the time, right? If you look at the grand eminences of the American mid-century, all of them had characters and things that were reoccurring from book to book to volume. And it also seems, I also think there's an argument that this is what everyone under a certain age has grown up reading, right? Like everyone under 30 has read 7 volumes of Harry Potter and 3 volumes of, I don't know, The Hunger Games or whatever. And that it's something that has kind of been lost from literary fiction is characters who grow through time. There is something about that which is enormously powerful, that a character that you re-encounter 5 years down the line, and who knows how much time has changed. But, you know, like, I mean, if you just think about, and this is a very highbrow example of an idea I had while watching Die Hard 4. But if you read the difference between John Updike's Rabbit Run and Rabbit Redux is unbelievable, right? Because in the first book, it's like this weird attempt at a kind of lower middle class manufacturing. Although I think he's a printer in it. And that's an okay book, but Rabbit Redux is a crazy book. It's a really crazy book where he suddenly has some kind of mental breakdown and starts like a New Left seminar or something in his house by inviting in vagrants. But that's still the same character. And there's something really powerful about that. And then if you get into Rabbit is Rich, then it's a very different book. And there's something about that growth through time with characters, which I think is really enormously powerful and has been kind of lost from literary fiction.
I do that. You know, my new book has the same characters.
Oh, does it?
Yeah, and it's also sort of comforting in a certain way because you spend so much time.
But you occupy a very peculiar space. You are like, like but you are. You're like the mystery writer sans mystery, right?
Well, that's not my fault. That's the marketing people's decision.
But the point about that is you can do that in genre.
Yeah.
In a way that for some reason has become less prevalent in literary fiction.
You know, Robertson Davies does it really well in his, I guess those are mysteries, but damn it. But they're not traditional mysteries. He brings back a character in a sort of peripheral way in the Manticore trilogy. It's interesting. And I guess it's a tradition that has been lost in literary fiction. Mystery writers, you got like 55 books on,
Yeah.
Henry, what's his name? Michael Connelly's Bosch? Like, you need 50 of them.
But I mean, even going before literary fiction, this is sort of how storytelling worked. It would be cycles of stories.
The Iliad and the Odyssey.
Yeah,
Got some of the same people.
Exactly.
In both of those.
Sure.
Funny enough, speaking about outsider friendships,
Mm-hmm.
Started reading Midnight Cowboy for the first time, which struck me as it never really became a youth novel,
Right.
but outsider friendship novels often become youth novels, whether or not they're teenage characters
Right.
or dissidents in their 20s or 30s. And I could almost see a novel like this, where people hanging on to each other,
Right.
having transplanted themselves, as Joe Buck transplanted himself
Right.
from Albuquerque, New Mexico, to New York, coming to find his fame and fortune as a gigolo.
Mm-hmm.
But that story, that friendship between Ratso and Joe was so powerful by the end, because that was a journey. I mean,
Right.
I feel that, and plus the way that friendship is presented, it's not really as much through action, but through the poetry of how Joe is thinking.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like this could be, in some ways, for me, the next Midnight Cowboy. Who knows?
Well, thank you.
Because I had just started
Thank
reading
you.
like
Yeah.
25% of it today.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I mean.
But I'm attracted to those stories. Like, even funny enough, even to my 40s,
Mm-hmm.
those stories really bring you in, because often you're not dealing with nostalgia. You're dealing with very emotional times, especially when people are,
Right.
in their teens and 20s. I
Right.
mean, everything is so heightened
Right.
and amplified, such as party scenes. It's all about
Yeah, yeah.
experience and making it through the night. And
No, I mean, I think about this all the time
Yeah.
because, a lot of the time. But I had this experience where I was in the grocery store, and I was like, and I just realized that, like, God, when I was 20, I used to think, how do I rule the world? How do I do this? And everything mattered so much. And now I'm just like, how do I get the good bread? Like, how do I get the organic bread? And I was just like, oh, God, I've gotten old.
What's that thing in your 20s, where you want to be famous, and until you realize you don't want to be famous?
Right.
Like, everyone I know had some idea that they wanted to be famous. And as you get older, you realize that that's sort of a conventional way of thinking, but also not for everybody. And I feel like I really love this. My best friend, we are the people in this book. We're also not. It's just like all friendships are, any sort of friendship can be grafted onto these two people. Though he and I did a lot of the same stuff.
Well,
It didn't make me nostalgic.
no.
It made me thankful to be alive.
Jarett, I read I Hate the Internet, and I thought it was deliciously funny to read. Laugh out loud funny. I wanted to copy out lines and then quit because it was all fantastic. My question is, can you talk a little bit about your influences in humor?
Sure.
And what that serves for you as a writer?
Sure. I before I answer the question, I would like to say that this question is asked by the man who invited me to the best party that I've ever been to.
Can we talk about that?
It would take 2 hours, but it was incredible. When I was working on I Hate the Internet, I'd been watching a lot of this British comedian's Stuart Lee. And Stuart Lee is sort of, I don't even know how you would describe it. I think the way that he sort of gets written about in the British press is as someone who has like a Brechtian approach to stand up and is constantly obsessed with the deconstruction of the actual act of telling jokes, and often we'll have jokes where there is no punchline, and the lack of the punchline is the joke. And after you've gone through 40 minutes of this, it goes from being the most intolerably annoying thing in the world to the greatest thing in the world. And he was a huge influence. And then the other one really was Vonnegut. I read Slaughterhouse-Five shortly after Ada had come out, and I had not read him since high school, and it was stunning to me what he did in that book. But then when I wrote I Hate the Internet, I didn't want to rip that book off because I thought ripping off a masterpiece was probably a really bad idea. So instead I ripped off Breakfast of Champions, the disappointing follow-up, and stole a ton of technique from that book, the thing in I Hate the Internet, where everything is defined, and which actually ended up becoming sort of a defense mechanism against the obsolescence of the book, because every time you write about technology, it rots. And so books that are about the internet a year later can be incomprehensible. Just started out as like, well, this is a really amazing thing that Kurt Vonnegut did, and I should shamelessly steal it. And I kind of think those were the two biggest influences on that. And then the other thing, too, is if you do enough readings, and when I was in San Francisco, I did endless readings just for really small crowds. The only real analog in our culture for the literary reading is stand-up comedy, with the exception being that in stand-up comedy, the politics are usually intentionally funny, whereas in the literary reading, they can be not intentionally funny and then accidentally funny. But it really is like, with stand-ups train. Like there's this discussion of it as a discipline, and how you do it, and how you work a crowd, and how you read a crowd, and how you learn about a crowd, and all of these things. And if you keep doing it, you get better. But we do live in this really weird literary environment where we throw everyone on stage and no one ever tells you anything about what the experience is like. And so I had started just paying attention to a lot of stand-up just to have some idea of how to make these experiences less torturous for me and also less torturous for the audience. Because, I mean, some of these things I did were awful. And you could just see people dying watching it and just being like, how do you avoid this? And there's no one tells you. When you're a writer, no one tells you how to do it. But you can watch stand-up and you can read about stand-up and you can
tell poets how to do it.
Well, no one told me. So.
Well, thank you so much
Thank you.
for talking to us. Here, we're supposed to shake hands.
While I'm shoving